as they start coming in. Let me see if my ring light may last the whole event or not.
Sorry, I'm having trouble.
It may not last, but I have better lighting in my office at work than I do in my house. But welcome everybody. I'm Franklin Escobedo. I'm the Community Services Director for the Larkspur Library and Larkspur Recreation. And welcome, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We'll be starting in a few minutes as more people come into the room. And if for some reason you get bumped off today or you lose your connection, we are recording today's event and we'll post it later on today to the library's YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch. We're asking if you have questions to please use the Q&A box. It makes it easier to relay the questions you have to our authors. And again, we'll start in a few minutes here, so. And just a reminder, the library's curbside is open. We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 12 to 4. So if you're looking for a book or looking for today's book, we're still, it's still in process because it's at my place and we haven't added it to the collection yet. But we'll be adding it to the collection so you can check out. But you can still pick up books, DVDs, movies at curbside at the library. We'll stop the share. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Franklin Escobedo. I'm the Community Services Director for the Larkspur Library and Larkspur Recreation. So we're here today and I'm excited to introduce our guest today is Derek Dwight Anderson, the author of Improbable Voices. So it's not a little book, but if you love history, this is a great history book. And I've just, have been fascinated with all the different things. But let's start off by Derek, so telling us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay. I am a teacher at Marin Academy in San Rafael, and I've been here for over 30 years. I've taught a wide variety of courses here, European history, world history, US history even. I was born in San Francisco. My parents were grad students over at Cal, and that's but I really grew up in the Northwest, in Portland and in Pullman, Washington. And I don't know, what else should I say?
Well, no, I mean, this is the basis. You have a love of history because that's what you do. So what made you decide that you needed to write this book?
In 2012, I had a sleepless night, and I was sort of thinking about my course and my students. And at the time, I was teaching a world history course using this book called History of the World in 100 Objects. And it's a wonderful collection of items in the British Museum, and they tell the history of the world through these objects. And I got to thinking, well, how else might it be done? And how else could it be done? And people were a logical choice, but then it became, well, how many people? And eventually I came up with the A to Z format that I use in the book. And I don't know, honestly, I think it's the most original idea I've ever had. And it just became this compulsion. I had to see it through and see what I could do with it. So, but that was the inspiration for the whole thing. It came out of my teaching, it came out of my students and my class.
Okay, well, and you picked a chunk of time. You basically started in 1450. Yeah. You bring it up. So, I mean, was it a conscious choice, or was just, this is how the people laid out that you wanted to explore and to tell their points of view?
My educational background is really as a modern historian. And while I teach some periods in ancient history for some of the classes I've done, it's not my forte. And so I didn't feel like I had the confidence or the background to be able to do something that went much back beyond the early modern period. And for me, I think I've always struggled to understand history until you get to that point where you have nation states, and I've always been really interested in the interaction between those communities and those states. So originally I was thinking about starting in 1500, but then as I looked at the characters that I ended up picking, I needed to push it back a little bit more.
Well, and so it was funny because I think it was when I started going back through the it that I realized that you had your alphabetical order of people really fit your alphabetical order. And I was like, how did that come about? Like, I mean, you start with Albuquerque and you end with Zickfield, but was that an easy choice to put all these different people, or the way you've divided the book up? I mean, how conscious was your alphabetical order of these? We say characters, but these are our real people.
These
in
are
history.
real figures.
They're real historical figures.
Yeah, they're real figures. It was a very conscious choice. I actually made lists of nominees. So like I looked at all of these people for letter D, let's say, and and then sort of the funnest part of the whole project was the puzzle. Like, okay, if I have someone from China, I can't have for this letter, I really shouldn't have somebody from China for that letter as well, right? And so it became this puzzle of trying to figure out how to put together a geographical distribution and a chronological distribution while honoring some of the big themes that happened. So that was a wonderful thing. And what's really interesting to me as a librarian is that I had this biographical dictionary still in the collection that it's the kind of thing that most libraries wouldn't keep anymore, but I've had the luxury of space in the library here at Marin Academy. And, it's short little descriptions of who people were, what they did, when they were born, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. And so that became the basis of my nominees. Like I could just go right through and get people, and then from there I sort of started to research them and figure out, well, who were compelling figures. And I also wanted to know that I was not going to do it from people who are well known, right? I mean, there's been enough stuff written out there about famous people. I wanted to try to do something that was looking at personalities in history, but who are not household names. So all of those components came together.
And then to do the alphabet in chronological order as well. That must have been a huge challenge as well, as finding people who fit into these time periods that fit your alphabet.
Yes, that was part of it, and that was part of the assigned goal. I think that there are lots of people who are qualified to write world histories. In fact, people far better qualified than I am. But I think that given the parameters that I established, what made it so fun was then actually being able to execute the plan and complete the puzzle. So it was like this little mystery.
Well, and I think that's one thing I loved about the book too, because it's sort of done in a different style than what I was used to when I was in school. That it's not, you didn't do, I remember in school, they segregated, the Eastern, countries, they did their whole timeline together, where you really do blend how world history really works, how all the different, how you like the world, like you've made it the way the real world really is. And I thought that was a really great way of doing it. And I think that, you're saying you don't know how to write, you didn't write that well. I think you did a marvelous job of writing a narrative of history that's easy to follow. And when you're reading the characters, I think we talked about this before, is that I love your use of footnotes. And, footnotes in history is always a great thing, but it's did you get pushback from your publisher for the footnotes, or because I know we've talked about endnotes and footnotes, and I do love a footnote. And especially when you're reading a history book, you want to read the footnotes instead of flipping to the back of the book.
Yeah, it's astonishingly to me how unpopular they are with publishers. But I kind of felt, and this again is my job as a librarian and as a teacher, I wanted to sort of model for my students what I thought good historical scholarship was and how it should be laid out. And to do that, I think you need to show your sources, and you need to be able to have those readily available. I mean, particularly in a book of this size, flipping all the way back to find, the reference, you've forgotten by the time you get there what the citation was. So that was part of it. And I really dislike the books that have the kind of in-text citations. Those just, for me, break up the flow completely. So it was, part of it was a desire to sort of honor and model for my students, but part of it was just personal preference, yeah.
And like I said, I mean, I thought it was the narrative of the writing style was really well done. I commend you on that, especially when some history can get, depending on how it's written, could be a little dry for someone who's not a non-historian, or doesn't have a passion for history. But I thought it was really engaging the way you did it. I mean, I like I said, I love the footnotes. You have lots of great photos in here, but it sounds like too, you've traveled a lot and you've seen a lot of these different places and statues and people.
That has very much been the other passion in my life is travel. And for me, though, that I used to travel just for myself, and then along about 1993, I won a grant to study and then bring that material back to the classroom, and that just opened up this whole world that, oh wait, travel isn't just for my indulgence. This is actually something that I can use and take back to my students. And then since 93, that's the kind of travel I've been doing. And then this book just became kind of another natural outcome of that passion and that interest. And I'm very fortunate to have been able to take those trips and see these places, right? But the one little anecdote is I wrote the Albuquerque chapter. It was the first one I did, and so I did that way back in 2012. And then in 2018, I had the opportunity to go to Europe over spring break and was able to do some research for 2 chapters. And part of that was then to go back to Lisbon and actually see this monument. And then I ended up rewriting the whole chapter using the monument to Albuquerque in Lisbon as a device into his life, and featuring different events in his life and trying to measure the accuracy of that monument, which is of course something that Americans and people around the world are dealing with now so much. What history do we honor, and what are these portrayals like, and how accurate are they, and how or not. So
yeah, and that's the homage is that history is written by the victor.
Yeah.
That's the most true statement I think we have is. So on your travels, was there somebody in the book that you discovered just from your normal traveling around?
Wow. I don't think so. I think that the people that I either traveled to see once I'd found them and determined them, or I'd already been to the place and then found somebody who was sort of fit for it. So an example of that would be Ibrahim. I went to Turkey in 2012, and was beginning to think about the book at that point, and realized, well, here I am in Istanbul, perhaps there'll be a character that comes out of this. And then all of a sudden, I learned that there's this madman of a sultan, at least that's his reputation. And then the more I read, the more I disagreed with that interpretation, and then that led me to the chapter the way it is. So there are some connections, but I think there's it's not a quid pro quo.
So someone just asked this question too, and I have the same thing. Was there a favorite person? Who's your most favorite out of all these people? Is there one that is your favorite person that you love to talk about the most?
Yeah, I think the person would have to be this Dutch doctor. His name is Gilbert Heck, and he sails for the Dutch East India Company. He makes 3 different trips to Indonesia. And in the process, on this last trip, he keeps a diary. And this diary is one of the great travel narratives of the 17th century that just nobody knows about, except, very specialized Dutch historians. And I was really lucky to kind of encounter it. But what makes the thing, I mean, he has plenty of prejudices. He's a product of his age, right? And yet he's trying to understand a world that he doesn't know. So he doesn't know what Buddhism is, and he's in Thailand, and he's taking care of the people working for the Dutch East India Company. But he's in Thailand, and he's seeing these temples, and he doesn't know what Buddhism is, so he doesn't have the reference points, but he's trying to describe them, and he understands that they're holy to these people. And I think the reason it stuck with me is that I was supposed to go to China in 1989, 6 days after Tiananmen Square, and of course the trip didn't happen, right? But I did have a ticket to Asia, and I decided, well, off I go, right? And because I hadn't, I had prepared a little bit for a trip for China, I hadn't prepared for a trip to Thailand. I just didn't know enough. And so here I was, in Thailand in 1989, trying to figure out what I was seeing, and just not having the background and having not done enough reading. And then all these years later, here I am reading about Gilbert Heck trying to do the same thing in actually the same places. And I think that has just given me this personal connection with him that I feel kind of passionate about. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's another thing too, is like, what kind of challenges did you face writing, historical nonfiction? I mean, there's a lot of research. I mean, and you can see that you've done a ton of research for this project. I mean, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced trying to do the research?
That varied depending on which figure. The Fernandez chapter, for example, he is a viceroy of both New Spain, Mexico, and then Peru. And there's never been a biography written about him, certainly in English, and I don't think there's ever even been one written about him in Spanish, at least not that I was able to find. And what is interesting, though, is that many books about New Spain or Peru in this period, there will be slight mentions of him. He keeps coming up. There'll be this reference, or there'll be this 4 sentences, right? And so the challenge for that chapter in terms of research became trying to take all of these little random references and string them into a coherent narrative. And that had a certain kind of challenge. Chapter Z on Zickfeld, she's a climatologist, works up at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. I don't have the strongest scientific background, and that one was really hard for me because it pushed me absolutely to my limits of being able to understand her conceptual climate models and being able to just understand what she was theorizing. And thank goodness for some of my colleagues here at Marin Academy who helped me digest it and sort of process it. But so each chapter had its own unique challenges. Sometimes a chapter like chapter on John Dee, the D chapter, there's been so much written about him, right? He's probably the most well-known of all the 26 figures. There's been so much written about him that it became the opposite problem than the Fernandez chapter. I was actually having to clear out space and figure out, well, what did I want to say? When in fact, in the last 10 years, there've probably been 4 biographies written on him. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's like, where do you clear the weeds out and to get to the heart of the story? I think too, the language barrier too, that you face language barriers researching a lot of the people, and the book does covers a wide range of everybody, of theology, government, science. But I think the core reason you wrote this book is because it's also helping us see the world in a different perspective. And I think that's one of your goals too with the book, right?
It is. I think that the problem with biography is it features so much around famous people, and those stories have been told. And one of the things I was really trying to do with this is to showcase the fact that people who are not household names have still made important contributions to the cultures in which they lived, and that they have an importance that I think is actually a bit more tangible and a little bit closer to the life that, all the people that we actually know live, right? Like, and so I think that part of it is trying to tell stories from different perspectives. And then part of that is also trying to tell stories of people who've been overlooked and who've been absent. I mean, it's stunning to me that this viceroy of Spain has not ever had a biography written of him. And if I, read Spanish better and I could get into the archives, maybe I could find the material more to do it. But it's been great to have the chance to learn all of this and as part of the process.
Well, that leads me to it. So is there a historical figure who did make it in the book that it was just such a challenge to find information about, or to find those sources to help you?
I can be stubborn at times, and on the whole, once I'd made the commitment to a person, I was going to see it through one way or another. So no, I think that there were some people that I did dismiss pretty quickly. They were on the nominee list, as it were, and then I dismissed them pretty quickly because there just wasn't enough material, or they didn't offer the book a different kind of perspective. One example would be chapter T is about this man from the Cook Islands named Taunga, and my original person for T was a German archaeologist named Tennants, and I wanted to do something in the South Pacific because, boy, if there's a region of the world that is overlooked in world history textbooks, that would be the one, right? And yet Tennants just in the end wasn't an interesting enough or compelling enough figure for me to warrant a chapter. So.
That's good. So here, I think we're sort of in that point where you did want to do a reading out of the book, right?
I can, if that's what people want. And
well, yeah, no, I think that you pick a part of the book that you really love and do a short reading, and then we can ask you some more questions about it too. So.
All right. Well, the selection that I've made, it can either go for about 4 minutes or about 7 minutes, and you can decide.
Well, no, I'll let you decide. So you.
We'll see how it goes. And I'll confess to all these folks out here that this is a challenge for me. So, but here it goes. So this is from chapter I. This is about the Ibrahim, the Sultan, who's known as being he's gone down in history as being mentally unstable. Every time the key entered the worn but durable metal lock, Ibrahim instinctively flinched in fear. His reaction was the natural outcome of his 23-year imprisonment in the cage. Perhaps today was the day his jailers would kill him. Ibrahim was the second oldest son of the Ottoman Sultan Ahmed I. In 1617, at the tender age of 2, Ibrahim was removed from the Topkapi Palace harem and consigned to a small compound where the brothers and sons of reigning sultans were held in secluded captivity. Known as the Cage, Ibrahim's new home consisted of a 2-story pavilion, a courtyard enclosed by a high wall, and a series of small rooms assigned to the cage's servants and concubines. On the top floor of the pavilion, the top floor of the pavilion featured tile-covered walls evoking Eden, inspiring domed ceilings, and a bronze fireplace, and windows overlooking the courtyard. Below, on the ground floor, the rooms were windowless, dark, and dank. While the 2 floors of the pavilion differed in ambiance, both were a prison. In order to eliminate all unauthorized communication with the outside world, many of Ibrahim's caretakers and servants in the compound were congenital deaf mutes, which the Ottoman court began using in the 1470s. By the 16th century, these servants had developed a highly sophisticated sign language that was handed down from generation to generation. Ibrahim's only other companions in the cage were other potential male heirs and sterile women, thereby eliminating any possibility of unauthorized procreation. This meant that Ibrahim grew up in such relative isolation that he had more in common with convicts in solitary confinement than he did with the heirs of the world's other powerful kingdoms and empires. Isolation and exclusion had long been a part of Ibrahim's life, but circumstances changed in 1632 when Ibrahim's older brother, Murad IV, ended his minority and assumed his full authority as Sultan. During his first year on the throne, Murad had 2 of his and Ibrahim's brothers assassinated. 5 years later, another brother also met the same fate, which meant that Ibrahim's fear only grew. So when Ibrahim heard the key in the lock on February 9th, 1640, he barricaded the door with furniture and refused to let anyone enter. When the men enthusiastically proclaimed that he was now the ruling sultan, Ibrahim did not believe them. It had to be a trick. These men had come to assassinate him, he believed. The men continued their pleas through the heavy wood doors, but Ibrahim did not budge. Instead, he demanded to see physical evidence. The men withdrew, a bit astonished, but returned soon enough and invited Ibrahim to see for himself. Cautiously, Ibrahim opened the window and the wood shutters beyond. A cold February wind blew in his face as he looked out onto the waters of the Golden Horn. In the courtyard below, Ibrahim saw the body of his dead brother, Murad IV, lying on the cold marble. It was true. Ibrahim had become the 18th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He was 24 years old. Ibrahim is usually known as Ibrahim the Mad. Even in the 19th century, this portrayal was so common that Nathaniel Hawthorne's most popular story during his lifetime evoked the Sultan's image as part of the New Englander's commentary on excessive zeal. Since then, historians have characterized Ibrahim as analogous to the Roman Emperor Caligula, as they took new ways to describe him. Ibrahim was simple-minded and incompetent, rapacious and bloodthirsty, detestable and debauched. One historian concluded that Ibrahim plumbed the depths of human inadequacy lower than ever before. Even one of the best plays about Ottoman history is called Ibrahim the Mad and features a sultan who is ruined by sexual, political, and spiritual power. Many of these descriptions, however, seem more focused upon characterizing Ibrahim's sexual gratification than upon the pressures he naturally felt as the sole remaining heir of the Ottoman Empire. Stories get told and retold about how Ibrahim had his city's hammam scoured to find additional beautiful women for his harem, or how he associated sensuous delight with physical size, sending agents out around the empire to find the largest women in service of his obsessive pleasure, or how he was so virile that he could enjoy the intimate company of 24 women in 24 hours. And yet these stories get contrasted with other stories of Ibrahim's protracted bouts of impotence caused by a curious streak in nature, an insatiable passion for women beyond his reach. The reason for these disparities in stories rests ultimately in Western misunderstandings as to the purpose and to the character of the harem. They also involve a rather lurid Western obsessiveness over what social commentator Edward Said called an irreducible distinction between Western superiority and Oriental inferiority. Indeed, these stories about the Sultan reveal more about the values of the historians writing about Ibrahim than they do about Ibrahim himself. And the reason I chose that selection was I hope it gives you a sense for how I'm trying to, in the book, look at the world from Ibrahim's perspective and comment on how the experiences in a character's life fit into a broader historical framework. So one of the things I do in this chapter from this point is then go and try to show how Ibrahim actually doesn't meet the clinical definitions for mental disorders or mental illness by modern standards, and that he doesn't actually even meet them for the standards of 17th century Muslims. And so it's probably in some ways my boldest chapter because it challenges the historiography in a really significant way. And I love sort of rehabilitating somebody who has been dismissed as being completely mad and actually trying to understand the pressures that he faced while he was trying to run this great empire in the world.
Well, yeah, and I think that you do a great job in that because people have forgotten it. You know, most history is written from a certain point of view, and I think that's what when you start to see the other perspective and you get it from the other side, you actually understand that we're still putting our filter of the world on top of somebody else's history, and I felt that was what you're trying to pull that filter off. So we really get a better aspect of viewing another culture from their point of view. And that's what I really liked. And even this stuff is like, when you really think about someone's upbringing, that is, being locked up in, like you said, in solitary confinement, pretty much the bulk of your life. Right. And then to keep having your family members assassinated, that wouldn't cause anybody to have issues. And then to be the ruler of one of the biggest empires in the world at that time too, it's just all this stuff that and that's why I think for most chapters you do that. You give us this new perspective on looking at it from a different point of view. With this, you start off with the stuff of us who've grown up in the West, that Western viewpoint, but then you start to bring it back to the viewpoint of other people. And I think anybody who's like, I've done a lot of reading that's been translated from the original language to English, and you start to get that worldview from their point of view. And I thought that was what I really liked about the chapters, that you're doing that. We're getting that perspective from the natives versus our interpretation of what it is. And I think that was a great example. And everybody who hasn't read this book, you need to, like, there are like really lots of gems in the book, and that I really loved. And this is why I think it's a great book to read. And if you're not a huge history fan, it's still an easy read. And it's a great way to delve into a different part of the world history. And that's why I really loved it. You did a great job at doing that. And that it could be your teaching background and your love of history. So
I think one of the things that struck me, Franklin, was that I think there's this dialogue that needs to occur. Like, on the one hand, I think it's important for us to try to see the past from the perspective of that time, but that doesn't mean that we absolve that past of it entirely. I mean, we need to retain our own bias and our own life experience as we're looking at the past. So part of it, I think, is this dialogue between letting go of our own biases and our own prejudices right now for a while, so that we can try to understand the perspective of a person in the past. But then we also have a responsibility to kind of hold these people accountable and then measure them against our values today. And for me, it can't be one or the other. And I know that there are folks who would disagree with me on that, but for me, it's the dialogue about how we look at the past. And I will say, as an aside, I think one of the things that happened for me over the course of the last 4 years as I was writing some of these chapters is I found myself being increasingly drawn to people who were rather measured and who were rather cautious. And that has to be a product of the environment that I'm living in, that I lived in over the course of the last 4 years, right? And for me, it was a reminder of the fact that historians are affected by the events that are in their own life and in current events. But then they also have to step back and try to see things from the perspective of any figure in the past.
Well, and that's exactly how I think you're spot on for, when you're trying to write a biography, you're trying to do research, because people, they try to say they don't, but it does. Their own personal biases, their own personal belief, and what's happening in the world around you is sort of influencing how you're looking at that information and how you're writing about it. But it's, that I think for writers, it's always a challenge, and especially when you're writing history or just doing research in history.
Right.
Do you, I mean, you can't forgive the sins of the past, but you also got to remember that was how it was back then. Sometimes it wasn't as horrified as we are. This is the way the life was for them. And it's not always the grandest and most beautiful thing, but I think too, as long as we remember that, and the other thing I think is just trying to remember that this stuff has happened, and not to have it repeat itself. We want to make sure that we know it's happened. And just to be cautious that history doesn't repeat itself. And I think that's one of the true lessons when you're really looking through history, because sometimes you do see that pattern. You see that things have repeated themselves, maybe not right away, but it could be a few hundred years later, somebody starting to do the same crazy thing someone else used to do. But here, let's see what kind of question.
I think that has to do with some of the universality of the human experience. Like, there are certain aspects that are very unique to a time and to a culture and to a place. And then there are other things in the human experience which are very, very universal. And that's why we keep making the same mistakes.
So one of the questions we got, many history books focus predominantly on Western world. How did you create diverse cast of improbable voices? Did you encounter many difficulties in your research in finding information about certain historic figures? I think we covered a little bit about that.
A little bit, but let me add that I was just, for me, being a world historian, it can't just be Western history, looking at people from Asia or from Africa, and it can't be the text box in the side note in a textbook. It's got to be integrated into the whole, or else it actually isn't worth saying. It isn't worth telling. But there were particular challenges. I'm reminded of the chapter for X, the Chinese General Shu, and there are an enormous number of events that happen in his life that are in very small villages. And for me, it was a wonderful reminder of what are the building blocks that historians use? Well, you got to know about chronology and time, that, because that's what helps trigger cause and effect. So literally the old-fashioned chronology really matters. And the other one was geography. Like, I personally couldn't make sense of what was happening to him and Shu's life without being able to figure out where the geography was. I had to know if he marched 15 miles from this place to this place, I had to know where that was and what that terrain looked like. And that was really interesting to try to find these names of what are actually even today small Chinese villages in rural Sichuan or somewhere, and so that would be another example of a different kind of challenge I faced, was in time at certain points, just, well, where did something happen? And that sounds so basic and so crazy, but it's astonishing how many times in the historical record, basic facts like where and when, that's not a given, people. And you can't assume. You got to double check and you got to make sure you understand. So.
Okay. So someone's asked, they asked it in the chat, is is this how you taught history before this research and book, or have you now changed the way you teach? Do you have any advice for other teachers of history?
Wow. It's a new book, so no, I don't think it's fundamentally changed the way I teach, but I do think that I've always learned from my students, and I've always benefited from their curiosity. And for me, there's always been this dialogue between what I can share with them, what I can tell them, and what they can share with me based on their own curiosity and learning and research. So I think that hasn't really changed. What was the second part? Sorry.
And then did you have advice for other teachers of history?
Yeah. I think the advice would have to be, don't take things for granted, because it's really worth spending the time to go back to the primary sources, and to look and read them for yourself, even if they're excerpts, even if they're short, but to not just to assume that just because it's in the textbook that I'd been using for 10 years, that it was the right thing. And in fact, I think one of the big things that comes out of this whole process for me is realizing how complex events are. Even things that seem simple are actually very, very multifaceted. And that's why the book is so damn long, is because, I was unwilling to give up on some of those details. I remember with Albuquerque, at one point he raids the Arabian coast, and that could be one sentence, right? I mean, he went up the Arabian coast and he raided a bunch of villages. Okay, end of story. But in fact, that was an important event for him, and it helped set the tone for other parts of his career and life in the Indian Ocean. And to ignore that is to lose part of the fabric and the complexity of history, and that's part of what I didn't want to do. So I guess my advice for teachers would be, hang on to content as much as you can, because that's what gives it the richness and gives it's the stories, it's the richness of those stories and that detail that kids actually enjoy and want to know. And I guess that would be my biggest takeaway from this whole project.
Okay, let me check the chat. If you have more questions, just pop them into the Q&A. And then, so someone asked you, how did you come up with the title?
I knew Voices as an idea came to me pretty early on, because I was trying to look at things from different perspectives and trying to share history of people who are not famous. the improbable part of it, I think, came a bit later. It had more to do with the dominant narrative that takes place in so many history books, and to try to sort of say, well, what word could describe a collection of unexpected historical figures and the perspective that they might bring on history. So Voices came early, Improbable came later.
Someone asked, did you find any surprising common threads connecting your characters to each other?
That's interesting. I'm not, oh boy, I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. Here's one that does come to mind though. There are a couple of examples of the figures where they overcome odds that no one expects them to be an important figure. I think of Eleni, the Ethiopian empress, and she's hired in an arranged marriage, and no one really expects much of her except to create offspring. And oh my God, she ends up being one of the most important people in Ethiopian history in terms of being this regent who serves in three critical different periods for Ethiopia, and that parallels in some ways what Julia Panas overcame. She was an illegitimate child, and she rose to become one of the foremost women of the salon, and having so many of the great figures of the Enlightenment come and be with her and learn from her. And she created this wonderful atmosphere, very unique atmosphere in Paris, where the free exchange of ideas was allowed. So those both are examples of women, and they're both examples of women who overcame their odds. I think of also a Korean painter named Kim, and he was from a middle-class background, and he became the foremost painter of the court and of the Korean court, and no one expected him to do that. And in fact, he didn't have the proper upbringing to have done that, right? And so these are tales I like, that where people overcome the odds to do something unexpected.
Okay. Someone asked, which characters should the world know about but doesn't?
Oh, wow. All of them? No. My first reaction was to say Ziegfeld and the world of climate change and what's going on. And I'm going to probably take that back because I think there's so many other people who've also written about climate change that we can probably understand that. I think I might go with somebody like Jahanara. She is an empress who, after her mother dies, sort of comes into this place where she is one of the foremost women in the court and has this enormous wealth because she's not dependent on court revenue to extend her influence. She actually has independent income that's outside of the royal treasury. And what she does with that is help mitigate family feuds within the Mughal Empire. And she also was a powerhouse. And I think that Americans in particular, when they think of Muslim women, they don't think of them in powerful roles. And Jahanara is a wonderful example of someone who was able to live her life to the fullest and have enormous influence on the Mughal Empire in the late 1600s.
Okay, so somebody asked us to please compare chapter B, the one about the Russians, Ivan Bursin, I can't say his last name.
Yes.
with today, with the quest for power of Russia today, or within the Orthodox Church.
Wow.
Complex topic right there.
some of these making me work this afternoon. I think that one of the problems that Americans get in trouble with is we expect Russians to be European. We expect Russians to behave like Western Europeans. And they aren't, they don't. Most of their history is actually not about the West. Their history is much more about Asia. And the upshot of that is that we struggle to understand them. We want to think that they're just like Westerners, and just their history and their habits are not. And part of that is religion. Orthodoxy is not the same as Roman Catholicism by any means. And part of that is geography. And part of that is, I think the size of that we're dealing with when we're dealing with Russia. Beklemyshev is a really interesting figure because he is in this very interesting transitional period for the Russians. I was stunned by how many books moved from sort of earlier Russia, Kievan Russia, to Ivan the Terrible. And Beklemyshev is in the middle of that. And it's a period where Russia's in transition, but it's sort of an untold era for Russia. They're beginning to get some Western influence, but autocracy and what we think of as the authoritarian Russian way of the Tsars ruling, that had not fully come into fruition yet, and Beklemyshev is trying to stand up to it. So he's an interesting figure in terms of the way that Westerners would traditionally see Russians, and then as Russians would see themselves in what is the role of an authoritarian government in Russia. Does that answer the person's question?
I hope so. So if you have any more questions, either put them in the Q&A or the chat. So. And like I said, it's a fascinating book to read, and especially if you do love history. So someone says, it's obvious that you made a committed effort to include diverse voices across many dimensions, so thank you. As you reflect now, are there any voices you would like to include that simply didn't fit into the constraints of your format?
There were a number of publishers who objected to the format because they sort of said, well, you had to have someone for letter V, and what if the most important person doesn't have that last name? And that is true. Latin America is underrepresented based on its population and its influence and its size. To not have the Filipinos in a world history, especially one of overlooked populations, is an oversight. It's a problem. Africa is not as well represented as it should be. So, and honestly, some of that was I had Latin America in particular. My goal was to find a Latin American woman who was a climatologist who specialized either in glaciation in the Andes or did sort of something in Antarctica. And I'm sure the woman exists out there in the world, but I just couldn't identify her. So, and that's why I ended up with Zickfeld. But by the time I got into to the end of the story, the end of the book, I really did need to have, I wanted another woman in the mix, and I really wanted to do something on climate and climate change. And I really thought I'd be able to find a woman in Latin America somewhere, and I just couldn't quite pull it out.
But you haven't found them yet. That's the thing. You haven't found
so
them.
There you go. Improbable Voices too.
Well, and the other thing, because you have your website as well. And
Yes.
you're adding to that all the time, aren't you?
Yes, I'm trying to. Yes.
You're trying to.
There's a blog that is a little bit, it's more personal, it's more accessible than the book in some ways, maybe. And it's more about kind of travel and world history and kind of that intersection of things you encounter every day.
Okay. And then so what I always love to ask the authors are, what are you working on now? What's your next project?
I'm still taking a deep breath. I'm still in excitement mode over this and trying to get the word out and hope that people will take notice of it, and that includes libraries and other kinds of places. The most recent book I've read is it's called The Library Book. It's by Susan Orlean. And it's about the history of the LA Public Library and the huge fire that the Central Branch had in 1986, I think it was. And one of the things she talks about, which I think is really true, she talks at the very end about the courage it takes to write and how crazy it is to put a book on a shelf. And yet she also says that all of these books are stories that they're calling out. They want their stories told and they want to be heard, because that is what these stories are, what connects all of us together. It's what connects us to the past and to the future. And so I guess my focus at this point is just trying to help get that book out as much as I can so that these stories can be shared with as many people as possible.
Well, no, and that's one reason we're here today. I thank you. We're trying to get you the exposure for the book because you've also published in a weird time where you would most likely hopefully have been on a tour and meeting people and talking about your book. But thank you again, Derek, for being here today with us. So.
You're very welcome, and thank you. I mean, I think this is an extraordinary program that the Larkspur Public Library puts out because it is hard as a first-time author to get your name out there and to get recognition, and that you are stepping forward and doing this with local authors in Marin is a real community service, and I'm grateful beyond words for that. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm just glad that you're willing to do this. But again, if you haven't read the book, I'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to where you can get it. And again, pretty soon it will be in the library's collection and hopefully more libraries collections around Marin. But thank you all for joining us today. And we'll see you soon. And again, thanks, Derek, for joining us. And I wish you luck and you keep me posted on the next book too. And we'll most likely have you back again. So
okay. Thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.